sticking around to the very sort of tail end, and it's Saturday afternoon, and so I really appreciate everyone being here today to come and hear a little bit more about green crab. I titled this talk "Catching Up on European Green Crabs on the Washington Coast" because I know a lot of you are already familiar. I've seen in the chat in just the past 10 or so minutes that folks are obviously familiar with the issue of green crab. I want to point out before we go any further and introduce myself as well, that so I'm, as Jackson mentioned, I work at Washington Sea Grant, and where I'm the program lead for a program called Crab Team. And Crab Team is fortunate to be able to draw on the expertise of a number of Sea Grant and UW folks. And we're also lucky enough to be joined today by Kate Lytle, who's the Deputy Director of Sea Grant, and Alex Stote, who's the Coordinator of Coastal Green Crab Monitoring with our program, as well as Sean McDonald, who is with the UW Program on the Environment and SAFs, but is a core participant of Crab Team, bringing a number of decades of expertise on this species specifically. So Crab Team was a program that has been focused on green crab out of Washington Sea Grant, actually starting in 2014 with a grant from WDFW to conduct early detection of the species along inland shorelines, as some of you might know. But the program has actually grown to support this increased need to address growing threats from green crab statewide. In particular, what our program does is provide species-specific scientific expertise in collaboration with managers, with tribes, agencies, et cetera. We also provide outreach and education on green crab to support these statewide management efforts. And so I also want to highlight our collaborators with WDFW. So for Aquatic Invasives, the Aquatic Invasive Species Unit is the jurisdiction management lead for European green crab in the state waters and shorelines. And some of you may know some of these folks. Alan Ployce is the unit lead. Chelsea Buffington is the lead of green crab operations. And I've drawn out one of the technicians here, Ron Coleman, who is the sort of coastal seasonal technician who's been working for the last few months specifically on European green crab. So I'll talk a little bit more about how all these players fit into the picture of what's been going on, but I want to highlight the fact that our program collaborates very closely with DFW, who wasn't able to be here today, in part because they've been sort of going down to the wire on getting as many traps in the water as possible before the tail end of the season. So I'm going back to this title slide to reflect on the fact that, this is very much catching up on European green crabs on the Washington coast. As I know many folks, this is not the first time green crab has popped up on the radar with respect to the coast. It's been a concern in the coastal estuaries of Washington, as far back as 1997, 98 when they first arrived. But the concern sort of died down after the last few decades and has since, in the last couple of years, become a renewed and indeed an even increased concern. So part of what I hope to accomplish today is to discuss what we believe are the mechanisms driving these trends and patterns, and to give you a snapshot of the status of green crabs, as well as what at least our role is in building, working towards a collaborative assessment and management effort in the coast. So for those of you, I don't take for granted that everybody knows the full history, so I'm going to provide just a quick snapshot of the timeline, catching folks up for some of you for whom green crab may be a relatively new topic. So European green crab, as the name indicates, is originally from the waters of the Northeast Atlantic Ocean, but the West Coast population arrived by 1989 and first arriving in San Francisco Bay. And we know from genetics that the population on the West Coast was first introduced from the US East Coast, the invasive population there. From that site, green crab were swept northward on particularly on strong El Nino ENSO conditions in 1997 and 98. And that's the first time they were detected on the outer coasts of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Since that time, they've continued this iterative northward spread. The current northward limit is Haida Gwaii in BC, as well as on the central coast of BC, just sort of north of Bella Bella. So in addition to that geographic history, I'm certainly happy to talk in much more depth about the biology and the ecology and potential impacts of this species and how those things relate to management and their invasiveness. For now, I'll just provide a quick cheat sheet on some of these factors, introducing you to green crab if you're not already familiar, and why this invasion is particularly concerning. So among other things, green crab is a relatively small, what we call a shore crab. It lives generally higher in the intertidal than adult Dungeness and rock crab, more similar to our native shore crab species. It has a really wide diet. It has extremely wide environmental tolerances for temperature and salinity. And these things sort of lead to it being a very, very tough species that can endure a lot of conditions that are otherwise challenging for many species. These are some of the factors that contribute to it being a successful invasive species worldwide, and contribute to the impacts that have been observed in other parts of the world as well, where it primarily changes ecological communities and habitats by being both a predator and a competitor of basically anything it can, get its claws around. This has been observed in a number of ways in a number of different contexts, particularly impacts to shellfish, as well as damage to eelgrass habitats and impairment of restoration of eelgrass and other shoreline habitats. In part, in large part, these impacts are really mediated by the green crab's tendency to become extremely abundant in places where it establishes populations. This obviously, if we were talking about a few hundred green crab, we wouldn't be super concerned about them changing things, but they have a penchant for becoming extremely abundant. And by virtue of just kind of like having to make a living, having to eat something and live somewhere, green crabs can have these dramatic impacts that can ripple throughout the ecological community in pretty dramatic and surprising ways. So those are the things that get this crab a reputation as being one of the most damaging invasive species and successful invasive species worldwide. So because of these factors, green crab was initially viewed with a great deal of concern in the late 1990s when it was first detected in Willapa Bay. And WDFW staff and partners conducted a large amount of trapping between sort of roughly 97, 98 and 2001. This is a figure from a 2002 report that was produced following the conclusion of that trapping, showing the locations that were trapped over the course of several years during that effort, mostly within the coastal estuaries of Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor, which have the most abundant, suitable habitat for European green crabs, and therefore where we might expect impacts to be greatest. But also in some of the other further north coastal estuaries, smaller river estuaries. During that effort, green crab were only detected within Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor. And I'm going to apologize for the quality of this figure, but it's very small in the report, so I wanted to enlarge it to give you a good idea of where green crabs were and were not found during those trapping efforts from ending about 2001. So large concentrations, particularly towards the mouth of both of the estuaries, but really widespread across these Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor at the time. So trapping really wound down around 2001. And in large part, that was because populations dropped dramatically in the year following those initial detections. And it seemed like green crabs might not ultimately become a problem. I want to point out this data set. This is compiled by Sylvia Yamada, Oregon State University, who some of you may know. Sylvia and her colleagues over the years have been conducting some long-term monitoring that has really informed what we know about trends in green crab on the coast over the last several decades. And I'm going to refer back to this data a number of times today. So I want to point out that what we're looking at here are the green line at the bottom is data from a single site, which is actually Stackpole, which has been monitored pretty consistently since 1998 at least. I'll also, for comparison, be showing Oregon data in the sort of reddish line. But the overall trend here is that the numbers dropped following the initial detections, and so monitoring in Washington more or less wrapped up from all of those sites that you saw in the previous map to basically just this Stackpole being the only site that's been consistently monitored since then. And the numbers actually stayed quite low for the decade and a half following that initial drop. These, you see sort of some years where green crab in Willapa Bay were entirely undetectable, even though folks were still looking for them. And then there would be a few years where they would be present in relatively low numbers. So the overall story from roughly 2001 to 2016 was one where there was just not evidence that green crabs had succeeded in establishing populations along the coastal estuaries. At the same time, there was no evidence that green crabs had invaded the Salish Sea shorelines of Washington, in spite of the fact that they had established very robust and successful populations up on the outer coast of Vancouver Island. And while a quote failed invasion is never attributable to a single factor, some of the things that may have been protecting Washington shorelines were related to oceanography at the time. So, for instance, in our large, shallow coastal estuaries, circulation dynamics appear to favor the export of larvae. So that is, the vast majority of larvae produced by green crab living in Willapa or Grays would get dumped out into the ocean or out on coastal beaches, which are habitats that are much less favorable for green crab survival. So second, the net westward flow of particularly surface waters through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, combined with good prevention practices, probably helped protect inland shorelines from larvae getting washed in from other coastal sources, even after green crabs were accidentally brought to this place called Souk Basin, which is up here on the southern coast of Vancouver Island in 2012. But in recent years, several lines of evidence point to changing conditions for green crabs in coastal estuaries. Actually in Washington state as a whole, and the first of which was detections at extremely low abundance along Washington's Salish Sea shorelines inland. Also in 2017, European green crab were detected for the first time in Macaw Bay. And you may have heard from Macaw from Adrian Akhmejian about some of those efforts there. And in 2017 through 2019 has also really been characterized by increasing reports from shellfish growers of finding green crabs in their operations in much greater abundances than they'd ever observed before. So, so these were all pointing to several lines of evidence that could indicate changing conditions. Now, I want to highlight here just for a second that while I'm talking about the Salish Sea and the coastal estuaries, within the same slide, these areas are connected, but they're also biogeographically distinct. That is, due to some of these oceanographic processes I've just talked about, it's not entirely apples to apples to compare the coast and inland shorelines in terms of what's going on with the invasion. So I want to talk specifically about coastal dynamics for the remainder of today, and also leave some time, plenty of time, hopefully, for discussion. So at the same time that those observations were sort of coming in, I mentioned that this long-term data set, the sampling in Stackpole is done by Andrea Randall, who was one of the DFW technicians working on green crab since the late 90s. I want to mention that this data set was echoing the observations of increased green crab abundance on the coast. And actually up through 2019, European green crab abundances, both in Oregon and at the one Washington site, exceeded the initial detection rates back in the late 90s when folks were so initially concerned. So, so this was taken all together, aroused a great deal of concern in the last few years. And in response, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife convened a meeting of tribes and stakeholders potentially interested in discussing European green crab observations and management plans. This was held in Montesano in February of this year. And a number of folks presented on what everybody knew at the time, what had been seen in the past, and we heard a couple of salient messages. One is that the conditions that folks are experiencing now are in fact different, categorically different in terms of the level of concern than being experienced in previous years. And second, that there was still a need for more information to get a clearer picture of what was going on and to inform management strategies. So I want to talk about what has happened since this meeting, since that time, but want to provide the context that this is very much a work in progress. We're in the middle of what was supposed to be a 2-year will probably be about a year-long assessment effort to move towards more information and action. But give you as much information as we have, that literally the data we have go back to being collected yesterday. So these are really hot off the presses. So from the February 19th meeting, this quaint opportunity we all had at the time to meet in person, DFW moved pretty quickly to secure a funding package and a proviso in the governor's budget that supported a year of expanded green crab management activity statewide. There was, on this list of activities that were funded by this proviso, is of interest to us a coastal assessment that was again supposed to last 2 years, that funded staff at WSG and with WDFW. A number of additional activities were related specifically to the Salish Sea, and then also provided funding for a couple of tribes who were working already on intensive removal efforts, including macaw. So I want to point out that this funding actually was a one-time effort that was awarded will be in effect through June 30th, 2021, so the end of this biennium. Obviously, everybody is already working to secure funding to continue not only the assessment efforts, which an assessment would probably ideally go on for a few years in addition to moving towards management actions, but also within both WSG and WDFW to continue these efforts. So we were cruising right along through March 12th, and then of course, around that time, I don't need to tell you what it has been like to try to launch a statewide collaborative trapping effort starting in March of 2020. And again, we're very much currently still in the middle of this effort. And so the effort has been an exercise in adaptive planning about what we have been able to accomplish relative to what we had hoped to accomplish pre-COVID. But quite frankly, I'm pleased, and I think we have been able to get a whole lot of work done to set the stage for ongoing management work. So I will update you on what we have managed to do. April through July was a very fast-paced, adaptive period of capacity building for the effort. Hiring staff and purchasing equipment during hiring and purchasing freezes and partners facing the same challenges. Working to build conversations with partners facing a lot of uncertainty in their own staffing and availability to participate and join us in fieldwork, and conducting trainings when we weren't able to meet in person. So amidst all that, we were able to move the efforts forward such that in July, myself, the technician from DFW, Ron Coleman, Green Crab lead, Chelsea Buffington, and Alex Stote, who's here today, who's the coastal coordinator, were touring sites in July to get some trapping going. And here you see us with Joe Schumacher out in Grays Harbor. So July, sort of training and site scouting, we were able to get our first traps in the water finally by August in collaboration with a number of partners. Just last week, or just actually yesterday, the last traps came out of the water more or less for the season. Trapping winds down. Seasonal technician positions with WDFW are sort of wrapping up for the season. It is possible to catch green crab in the winter. However, tides make the work difficult, and we catch them at sort of lower rates than we do in the summer. So generally our trapping season runs more or less March through October. So I'm going to spend the remainder of the time talking about the overall results, what's been done since 2020, since August of this year. And what I want to outline is that we're looking for green crab using several different trapping approaches. We're deploying what we call Sentinel Sites, where we set a few number of traps but collect lots of data. These are sites that are trapped monthly, and our goal is to assess seasonal patterns and ecological associations of green crab. Trapping is also being conducted through larger scale efforts we're calling assessments, where many traps are set. Limited data are collected on each trap, but this provides us a snapshot of green crab range, relative abundance, and habitat use. We're also pulling in data from a removal site, where efforts are ongoing to remove as many green crabs as possible and remove them efficiently. And then also employing the data from the time series site, where again, relatively small number of traps, but ongoing long-term data collection enables us to look at the population trends over time. So I want to outline where those sites are. Our Sentinel sites here are shown here along the coast, all the way from Macaw Bay down to Nakata. These are monthly efforts from April through September. We record data not only on green crab, but all of the species that are captured in the traps. And these efforts are often conducted in collaboration with partners who take ownership of a Sentinel site and conduct the sort of data collection and once per month at these sites. I want to highlight that those partners have been extremely adventurous with us this year in taking on this pilot work when we had sort of limited capacity to do the training that we typically like to do and provide support. So folks were extremely adventurous with us. So Adrian with Macaw started a Sentinel site up at the Wyatch. Quinault worked with Joe and his colleagues to start a site at Ocean Shores, worked with Larissa and the Shoalwater Bay tribe to start a site in Tokeland, and David Begley and Zach Forster at Stackpole. At Nakata, we're working with Roberto and his crew at Taylor to start a site. And this is a photo of David Begley and Alex out at the very first traps coming out of the water this season, already finding green crabs right off the bat. So this was a total effort, 5 sites trapping for 2 months. Again, a relatively small number of trap sets, 60 trap sets, but nevertheless an important way for us to get a really good view of what's going on. I want to point out that we are going to continue to scale up this effort and start probably at least 4 or 5 more Sentinel sites next season. Assessment sites are sites that are trapped typically one time, and it's a large number of traps over a wide geography. It's an intensive trapping effort that'll go on for 3 to 5 days. Typically, these are led by WDFW and WSG personnel, so Ron and Alex specifically, but can be done in collaboration with partners. So I wanted to share a socially distant field photo of Alex, Ron, and Richard from the Shoalwater Bay tribe trapping out in Tokeland earlier this year. It's heavy lifting for sure. So 12 sites since August have been trapped. The scale of these efforts is much larger, and we're able to conduct a lot more effort, which is great. We're also pulling data from removal sites. In particular, Adrian at Macaw is probably the site on the coast that's doing the most removal trapping and has been since 2018. As you may or may not know, her program does trapping as resources allow, but prioritizes getting as many green crabs out of there as possible. She has 3 sites, 2 on the coast in the Wyatch and the Suyas rivers. This year, as of my last update that I have, she had set 466 traps. So again, this is a relatively intensive effort, often done with MRC interns as well as tribal interns. This was Cole, who was an intern a couple of years ago, working with one of the tribal interns. And then the tribal time series at Stackpole, I want to just give you a little detail. This is again monitored since 1998, but it's actually targeted towards looking at the young of the year. And it has been monitored consistently by Andrea Randall for a very long time, which makes it a really valuable data set, largely funded by the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. And again, one site, 20 trap sets roughly per year to a couple different trap types. So these are all of the sites that were sampled during 2020 with trapping. And the first thing that I want to point out in terms of the findings is that European green crab were found at every single site at which we looked. So far we haven't found sites where green crab are not present. Of course, we're starting with the sites where they're most likely to be present, the best habitat. But nevertheless, across the range of sites we've sampled, they are present at least in some numbers at every site. But they're not currently evenly distributed. So green crab abundance does vary across these sites spatially. Here I'm showing you a map where the sites have been summarized by the average number of crabs you would catch if you set about 100 traps. And what I want to point out here is that this is sort of a catch per unit effort in this case, lumps together a number of different types of trapping. So it's not a perfect comparison, but it's generally a pretty good summary of what's going on. And I've just, for your information, ranked the sites of what the CPUE is for everything, all of the data we have available for 2020 across these sites, with Ocean Shores leading the pack at 433 crabs on average that you catch when you set 100 traps, ranging down to the sites South Willapa Bay generally, and Grass Creek, which is sort of one of the more eastern sites in Grays Harbor. I want to zoom in here on the coastal estuaries so we can look at some of the spatial trends. And one of the things that jumps out to me is that there's increasing abundance towards estuary mouths. So in both cases, generally the sites that are closer to the mouths have a greater abundance of European green crab. And this is a pattern that is expected if green crab larvae are coming in from the coast, and it was seen during the last sort of the assessment efforts. The other thing that's important to note is that green crab are present in South Willapa. So this dot here down at the bottom is very, very light pink. That from that last slide I showed you, that was the lowest on the scale, but green crab are still present in places where they were never found during the previous assessment efforts in the late 90s. Also, if we add 2020 to this long-term data set, we see that the abundance at this one site, Stackpole, remains high relative to the prior 2 decades. So far, we do not see evidence that this is another sort of boom-bust cycle, that green crab are going to disappear the way that they have. It's only been, you know, a relatively short time. Green crabs can live up to, 6 or so years. So we may need a little bit of time to know whether or not they're going to quote disappear on their own. Nevertheless, the fact that the abundance is, on a different order of magnitude leaves us a lot of concern. So to summarize what we see as the relevant observations that we've been able to make so far, green crabs are present everywhere we've looked for them. There we see spatial patterns that indicate that they do have sort of some distribution trends, and their abundance continues to remain extremely high, higher than was observed during the initial range expansion. Now, what does this mean in terms of what happens next? Our biggest question that we often get asked is, are we going to see a repeat of these boom bust? Are green crabs going to disappear again? Or is this a shift? Are we seeing something that's going to switch us to a different state where green crab are now a part of the ecological community, and we can't just expect them to go away on their own? And I want to talk about 2 sort of observations that we have so far that may inform that, or at least be something to consider. One is this comparison of Oregon to Washington data. We know from some modeling work and observations that it's most likely that the coastal estuaries were historically experiencing green crab as being advected from southern populations, particularly the most robust ones in California, but likely increasingly from the closer populations on the coast of Oregon. Oregon has also seen, and in fact, they saw it a few years ago, a few years before we did, this rapid population increase where now they think that they are experiencing a shift where these sort of previously transient populations are now resident. We also we could begin to see, we have this sort of time lag between us and what's going on in Oregon, which may be in part to conditions or to the fact that, you know, we get larvae after Oregon does. So what could this mean? This could mean that we continue to see European green crab as we are now, because we are continuing to get more larvae from the south, or the populations could also get greater if populations to the south continue to increase. That said, I've been hearing that we're gearing up for a La Nina year, which is less favorable to the spread of green crab. So there may be periodic breaks from green crab if this advection from the south is really what's driving what's going on in the coastal estuaries. But another thing we should probably consider is the potential for larval retention in Willapa Bay. Recall that I mentioned that one of the reasons that green crab failed to establish previously is that most larvae produced by green crab leave Willapa Bay, they get exported. But there's now looking at potentially a more complex story, and a lot of this is coming from a modeling study done by Neil Banas, and Sean also participated in this study, looking at retention of green crab larvae across Willapa Bay. So these figures show, based on the spatial location of larvae released, what's the probability that a larva would be retained somewhere within Willapa Bay. And you can see that that probability changes depending on where the larvae are released from. And particularly, larvae that are released from crabs that are further south in Willapa are more likely to be retained in that estuary. So what this means is that, you know, now that we have seen green crab in the southern portion of Willapa Bay, that's another reason that is a particularly notable finding, because they could sort of contribute to a state change in populations within the estuary. Okay, so I want to just provide a quick few thoughts about what's likely to happen sort of next as far as we know, but again, highlight that we are in the middle of this large statewide effort. We're still learning more. Certainly one of the things we need to do first is debrief from the 2020 trapping season. I've told you a little bit about what's going on. It's still very new to us. The traps are still literally being decontaminated and put away, so this will take a little bit of time this fall. Over the next several months, we're going to be continuing to focus on partnership development. So we firmly believe that we're seeing so much fantastic energy and interest in green crab, and what we're hoping we can, the role that we're hoping that we can serve as Sea Grant is to serve as a sort of a nexus or a collaborative partner and help people work together to leverage everybody's efforts for a larger coordinated understanding and management effort of green crab. So rather than a constellation of groups that are working separately, we'd like to sort of build on what we know and move forward and have everybody sort of leverage each other's efforts. So partnership development is a huge part of that. We haven't had a chance to talk to everybody we would like to, and get everybody talking to each other. The assessment work will continue at least through the end of June, at the end of the biennium, and as I mentioned, we're already working to continue that out longer. It's also our goal to continue to expand capacity outside of these organizations within folks who are doing Spartina work and other crews to be able to conduct trapping and be able to work on the green crab management issue. And ultimately, of course, the goal is to identify vulnerabilities and entry points for management interventions and priorities as well. So this, I want to leave, you know, the remainder of the time for conversation among all of us, but I also want to take a second to just to just really, again, highlight the partners who we have had a chance to work with so far, as well as all of the folks we've had conversations with about green crab and the goals that we share and the priorities for future monitoring. So with that, I'll put up a reminder of my our contact information, and I guess open the floor for questions and conversation.